Welcome to those of you who have joined today's webinar. I'm Maria Williams with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Che enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnership calls and webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Che EDC Strategies Partnership Webinar, which is titled The Obesogen Effect, Why We Eat Less and Exercise More but Still Struggle to Lose Weight, a conversation with scientist and author, Dr. Bruce Blumberg. Our moderator and interviewer today is Jerry Heindel, Director of the Program on Endocrine Disruption Strategies at Commonweal. We will leave time following the interview for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentation. After the interview, our moderator will read out questions for our speaker to respond to. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speaker. This webinar is scheduled to last for 30 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Maria. Welcome and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you're located today. As Maria said, I'm Jerry Heindel, and I'm going to be leading today's webinar. And today's speaker is Dr. Bruce Blumberg. Bruce received his bachelor's degree from Rutgers University and did his PhD in postdoctoral studies at UCLA. He then trained in molecular endocrinology at the Salk Institute, and he joined the faculty of the University of California, Irvine in 1998. And he's currently professor of Developmental and Cell Biology, Pharmaceutical Sciences, and Biomedical Engineering. The Blumberg Laboratory studies the biology of nuclear hormone receptors in development and disease, and it's been particularly interested in the last few years in endocrine disrupting chemicals and the development of cancer and obesity. His lab has published extensively on the role of tributyltin in causing obesity, and more recently showed that maternal exposure to tributyltin led to epigenomic changes that can be transmitted through 4 generations. So it's obvious that Bruce is a leader in this new field of obesogens. Indeed, he coined the word obesogen in his 2006 publication, and this publication and the obesogen hypothesis of obesity really stimulated interest in the field. And now Bruce is doing it again. He just published a book, and the title is The Obesogen Effect, Why We Eat Less and Work Out More but Still Struggle to Lose Weight. And Bruce is going to talk about his book today. So welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning. Good afternoon.
So Bruce, I understand that you came up with the term obesogen. Tell me a little bit about where that term comes from and what it means.
Well, when we first discovered that a chemical, tributyltin, could make cells in culture become fat cells and could make animals fat, we asked ourselves, what should we call such a chemical? And the obvious answer was obesogen. We didn't know that it wasn't a word before that. It just seemed like the word we should use. So that's the origin.
So, and that led you to develop the obesogen hypothesis. What does that hypothesis actually say, and how does it differ from the prevailing wisdom?
So the obesogen hypothesis says that there are chemicals in the environment that can cause us to become fat, either by directly acting on fat cells to make more of them, to make them larger, to make them more efficient at storing fat, or by indirectly affecting our weight by affecting the control of appetite, satiety, and metabolism. And that differs from the what I call the orthodox wisdom, which is calories in, calories out, all calories are the same, eat less calories and you'll be slim. And clearly that's not working.
So what do you think is the strength of the data of the obesogen hypothesis today?
In my view, there's really 4 main lines of evidence that support the obesogen hypothesis. The first and most important one is that there are pharmaceutical drugs that we take that have the side effect of making people obese. Thiazolidine anti-diabetic drugs make people fat. Atypical antipsychotics make people fat. Different kinds of antidepressants make people fat. So if there are drugs that can make us fat, why wouldn't chemicals that target the same cellular pathways have the same effect? Second, we already know of the existence of about 50 chemicals that when we expose animals to them, they will gain weight later. We know that there are even more than that, that when we treat cells in culture, we can convert them into fat cells with these chemicals. And probably the fourth line of evidence is that we know that animals living together with us, our pet cats and dogs, feral rats, wild rats living in cities, and critically, 5 different species of animals living in research colonies where we control their diet exclusively are all getting fat over the past 30 years. So something about living near humans is making these animals fat. And lastly, there's a study that just came out last year showing that when you account for calorie intake and calorie burning through exercise, even at the same level of calories in and exercise output, people are 2.3 BMI points higher today than they were in 1988. Something else is going on.
Mm-hmm. So I understand there's a lot of data in the animal literature. It's easy there to give exposure during development to a chemical and look at weight gain later in life. But in the human situation, it's going to be much more complicated in that. Do you think that a particular chemical is actually itself causing the obesity epidemic, or what role is it playing?
So that's an important yet difficult question, right? So we have good evidence from animals that some chemicals can cause obesity or can predispose the animals to become obese. We know that humans are exposed to the same chemicals. There are a very few epidemiological studies that watch people over time and measure early life exposure and later life outcomes, and those also support the obesogen hypothesis. But we need to know a lot more than we currently do in order to understand just how big a contributor chemicals are to the obesogen hypothesis, or to the obesogen epidemic, sorry.
So one of the things I noticed in reading your book, and you alluded to it a minute ago, is in addition to the obesogen hypothesis per se, you've been talking about the idea that a calorie is not a calorie. And that's something that regular doctors and people talk about all the time. It doesn't matter if it's a calorie from this or that, it's a calorie, it's the same thing. But you seem to indicate that that might not be true all the time.
Right, so that's a fundamental misunderstanding that people have. I like to say a calorie is a calorie only when you're trying to heat your house. A calorie is a unit of heat energy. So the way calories are determined is you take some substance and you put it in what's called a bomb calorimeter and you heat it in the presence of pure oxygen and you see how much heat it gives off when you burn it. In the body, it's not a bomb calorimeter. Your body uses different kinds of calories different. So a calorie of glucose is not metabolized the same as a calorie of fructose, is not metabolized the same as a calorie of butter or as a calorie of protein. Your body metabolizes them differently. So the only time at which a calorie is when you're eating many less calories than you ought to. So if your body, like mine, needs around 2,000 calories to support itself, and you eat 1,000 calories, it doesn't matter what those 1,000 calories are, you'll lose weight. They could be 1,000 calories of ice cream, 1,000 calories of Twinkies, 1,000 calories of rice crackers, you're gonna lose weight. But as you approach the amount of calories that you need to sustain your body, the type of calories matters quite a bit, and whether they get stored or burned and where they get stored. So really this idea of a calorie is a calorie really doesn't apply. It's antique knowledge.
Okay, thanks. So let's move to the book. What made you decide to write this book, and who did you write it for?
So that was also a tough question. So probably 5 years ago now, Nick Kristof from the New York Times wrote an article about obesogens, that he thought they were something that were important, that might be important in the obesity epidemic. And I started getting calls from literary agents. And I confess I never thought about writing a book at that point. And one of the agents, who's now my agent, Bonnie Solo, was very persuasive, and she kept gently reminding me that somebody needs to write a book about this. It's really important. So finally she persuaded me, and I decided to write a book, not for scientists like you and me, but for the concerned layman, for someone who wanted to understand why it is that they or their kids were fat or might become fat, and what to do about that.
So what's the main message then that you want the people to take away from the book?
I guess the main message I want people to have is that they're different, and it's good to be different. This idea that we're all the same and that we all respond the same way to calories, either too many or too few, is just not true. That some of us may be programmed by our genes and by the exposures that our moms and grandmothers and great-grandmothers had to use calories more frugally is not necessarily a bad thing. And instead of a curse, you could actually consider it a kind of a superpower, right? You eat less calories and you can still survive and store more of those. So we'd all like to be able to eat as many rich and fattening foods as we can. But if you think about it a different way, the fact that you can get by with less is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And we need to view it that way and just accept we're different, those of us whose bodies work that way, and you have to act accordingly. You can't eat the same number of donuts as your skinny friend.
So when you talk about your solution to the obesity epidemic, and it relates to chemicals, is there any specific time during your lifetime where you should be more worried about chemicals than others?
That's a very good question. So there are many chemicals we know can make adults fat. And of course, we'd not like to do that. I think a more troublesome situation is when a pregnant mom is exposed to chemicals, and then the child and potentially the child's descendants are then programmed by that exposure to use calories differently. So we know that that happens from things such as the Southampton studies and the Dutch famine studies, that the prenatal environment matters a lot in lifelong programming. So I think that exposures during very early life, either before mom is pregnant or when she's pregnant or when kids are young up until about puberty, play a very important role in the life course and how the rest of your life will play out. So I think those are the times when we need to be most concerned. Although we should be concerned always, but if you're going to say, what's the area where I can make the biggest impact, it has to be then during pregnancy and early life.
So I noticed that in your book, you talk about a plan to help reduce exposures, assuming then that reducing exposures would reduce their effect on weight gain. So tell me a little bit about this plan and how a normal person would take advantage of that.
Right, so when we were writing the book, it became clear that we shouldn't just tell all the scary possibilities, that we should offer some solutions. So really the plan is relatively straightforward. The number one thing you have to do is take control of your diet, of what you eat. Stop eating packaged processed foods. Instead, eat foods that you make yourself from ingredients that you select yourself. And if those ingredients are organic, so much the better. But even if they're not organic, you're way better off than eating packaged processed foods. You'll control what's in there. You'll reduce your exposures to the chemicals in packaging, to the chemicals used to grow them, to various kinds of preservatives. So control of your diet is job one. I think the second job is to get plastic out of your life as much as you can. We're inundated with plastic today. If you look at pictures of islands in the ocean, you can see them buried in plastic trash that just happens to float there. We have too much plastic in our lives. Many of these kinds of plastics leach chemicals that are endocrine disruptors, which you know very well, can disrupt a whole variety of processes in our body, including predispose us to obesity. So the less of those that we have in our life, the better off we're going to be. And then the third thing is to get rid of artificial sweeteners, to reduce your exposure to all kinds of agrochemicals, pesticides, fungicides, flame retardants, get good sleep, make your environment as health promoting as it can be.
So I know there's a faction of people out there that focus on different kinds of diets, and one of the things they talk a lot about is detoxifying diets.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any kind of benefit there if you're exposed? Is there what things you can do to actually help get rid of these chemicals, or once they're kind of there forever?
Okay, so let me give you an example from our animal experiments, and then we can see how that might relate to humans. So we expose a pregnant mouse to very, very low doses of tributyltin, the kind of doses that you and I are exposed to. And then we look at what happens to the children who were exposed, the pups that were exposed during pregnancy, and to their offspring, and to their offspring, so 4 generations later. So only the pregnant mom was exposed, yet the effects persist for 4 generations. So when you think about the situation with humans, yes, if you reduce your exposure, that's a good thing. But if you're a child who's been exposed during early life, it's unlikely that you'll reverse those effects that were programmed. That means that you will have to fight those effects. You can't just detox to reverse them. The chemical's gone. And detoxing to remove a chemical that's already gone isn't going to be that helpful, although it may help you to be rid of other chemicals. But the effects on what we say is the epigenome persist. So we have to accept that, okay, my body's different now, and I need to take a different approach to my life if I want to be lean and healthy long term.
So I think it was really important that you and others have shown these transgenerational effects, but it's likely that the effect of environmental chemicals will be even worse than that, since what you're doing is just exposing the F0 and seeing effects all the way through the generations. And in the human situation, then each generation during pregnancy is exposed again, and then they're exposed again throughout their lifetime. So you think maybe the effects are going to be compounded over generations. Is there any data on that?
I don't know who's studying that. That's an important question. For our part, we want to understand what happens from that first exposure before we try to understand what happens from the first, compounded with the second, compounded with the third. It's something you can't study all at the same time. You need to understand what's the effect of one, and then we can ask the question, well, what happens if we don't stop that exposure? If we continue to expose, or we expose to another chemical? Let's say we replace a plastic with another chemical. What is the effect of that? We're just really at the very dawn of this research.
So now that the book is out, what do you really want to see as the impact on, because it can have an effect on the science itself, on lay audience, on clinicians, on policy. Are you looking at all of those and hoping that your book will impact them?
Well, because the book is written for a lay audience, my hope is that it will impact people directly, that they will understand that if they wish to have a different life, they need to take control. No one's going to protect them. The government isn't reducing these exposures and keeping harmful chemicals out of food. It's up to each of us to control that. For clinicians, I've written several articles for clinical journals, and I would like it if clinicians would understand that there are such things as endocrine disrupting chemicals and obesogens, and that people would be better off without them. At the federal level, at federal regulatory and policy people, I'm pretty cynical about what's going to happen there. I don't think we're going to make any big impact there because there's too much money flowing into that level of government from industry. On the other hand, working with local cities. So I live in Irvine, California, which is the first non-toxic city. A group of passionate parents in non-toxic Irvine persuaded the city council to ban the use of toxic pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides on all city properties. And that effort is spreading one city at a time. So I think grassroots efforts, people concerned about their lives and environments, can have a very big impact. And eventually, if enough cities say, we don't want these chemicals around, the federal regulators will have to listen.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So do you have any final comments that things I didn't cover that you want to, points you want to make?
I don't think any points that I want to make, but I'd like to acknowledge you, Jerry, for writing a very important review 15 years ago that started people thinking about the effect of chemicals and obesity. No one ever thought about that before your article. So I'd like to thank you for that.
Wow, thank you so much. So thanks, Bruce. I think this has been a terrific discussion. So the first question is, what fraction of the obesity problem would be attributable to obesogens compared to the intake of macronutrients and calories?
So that's a difficult question, and we need more epidemiological studies in order to be able to answer that question. So what we know is that from the one study that was done and that we participated in the European Union, that quite a significant fraction of healthcare dollars for obesity and diabetes were attributable to chemicals. To predict what's the full spectrum, we need a lot more information than we have.
So the next question is, what tests do you think somebody like the regulatory agency like the FDA should do, or at least urge other companies to do, to test for obesogens?
Also a difficult question. So we know lots of ways to test for the effects of chemicals that can promote the development of fat cells, that can promote animals to be fat. It's certainly possible to do that kind of testing, but considering that we don't even do very rudimentary health testing, it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to convince the USDA or the FDA to test for obesogens. We can't even get them to test for whether chemicals are reproductive toxins, for example. There's relatively little testing required.
So here's a question about artificial sweeteners and what people should do about them and the possible role that they may be contributing to obesity. You want to say anything about that?
Right, I discussed that in the book. There's very good data that says that artificial sweeteners change the composition of the microbial populations that live in your intestines and can promote obesity themselves. So unless you're diabetic and you need artificial sweeteners as opposed to normal sweeteners, you're better off without any added sweeteners. So removing added sugars and sweeteners from your life is a good thing.
So if you wash produce and other foods, is that useful to help get rid of chemicals?
It's somewhat useful, but you have to remember that when chemicals are sprayed onto fruits and vegetables, they have additional compounds in there that help them to stick, right? Otherwise the rain would wash them off. So it isn't just as easy as rinsing chemicals under, running water to get rid of all the chemicals. You need to be more aggressive than that.
So this question says, thinking about the 80-20 rule, what are the biggest offenders that we should avoid?
The biggest offenders, I would say, are processed, packaged foods, anything that has added sugar, sugary beverages of all kinds, doesn't matter where that sugar comes from. I think those have to be very big players.
So what about the PFOS and the PFAS and phthalates and?
Yeah, you need to be rid of those as well. So to the extent that you can get rid of all of these kind of chemicals, you're going to be better off. Some of them affect obesity, some of them affect fertility, some of them promote cancer. You're just simply better off without them. Mm-hmm. There's no benefit from consuming these chemicals.
Since you're out there talking a lot about this and presenting this at like the Endocrine Society where you just came from and writing this book and stuff, do you get a lot of pushback from industry about this?
We used to. We got pushback from the medical industry even in the very beginning. Now as people see the data, they're much more open-minded. Yes, the industry troll sites will say there's no evidence and blah, blah, blah. It's all about calories in, calories out. But if that were true, why do we continue to get so obese? Everyone knows that we eat too much. Everyone knows that we need to exercise more. And in fact, there are twice as many health clubs as there were now 20 years ago. The obesity rate in the US just jumped to almost 40%. from 35% just 4 years ago. Obviously, if all of these things that we know well were the major drivers of obesity, we wouldn't be obese.
So the question is, do exposures to obesogens produce obesity always early in life, or is it mostly a latent effect that doesn't show up till adulthood?
So in our mouse models, where we've tested that carefully, the obesity doesn't show up until adulthood. So when we expose the mice in early life, during pregnancy and maybe while they're nursing from mom, we don't typically see that obesity until the animals are adults, and we challenge them with a slightly higher fat diet. On a normal low-fat diet, they get slightly fatter. But as soon as we change that diet to even 20% fat, they get obese within a week. So I think that the effect of chemicals largely occur a bit later in life, but that certainly hasn't been exhaustively studied.
So this question asks about school systems and packaged foods used in school lunches, and what public policies would you encourage to help clean up that part of our environment? Because there are a lot of low-income people who are dependent on school lunches, and maybe they're getting some exposures there.
Absolutely. I would encourage schools to prepare food like they did when I was a kid. We had people that cooked in the school cafeterias and made lunches, and they might not have been the same quality as if mom made it, but it was certainly better than opening packaged food or buying, power bars from a machine. I sometimes go to local schools and for something called Ask a Scientist Night to tell kids what life as a scientist is about. And I'm horrified to see the soda machines and the candy machines and all the kinds of junk food right there, easy for the getting. That shouldn't be the case. Where's the fruit machine, for example? We need to see those.
So does your book have a list of the major endocrine disruptors that are obesogens?
It does.
And do you have any social media messaging prepared that advocates can start sharing on Facebook and things like that?
So I have a website where we discuss a lot of these things and link to a lot of the both popular and scientific articles on this.
So this reader would like to know about the epidemiology studies. I know you personally don't do that, but there's a lot of people looking at birth cohorts and exposures to environmental chemicals and weight effects later in life. And how well does the animal data and the epidemiology data match?
So in the cases where there are animal data and epidemiological data that follows people over life, right? So you can't just look once. You need to look at an exposure in early life and then follow those people later. So to the extent that those studies have been done, the animal data are completely in agreement with the human epidemiological studies. So for example, Michelle Lemerle just published a systematic review of the effects of DDT in obesity, and can show that, summarized all the evidence that's available that showed that DDT is in fact an obesogen. And although we don't use that anymore, when you and I were kids, DDT was everywhere.
So what about other pesticides? Are there some of the pesticides that we're exposed to so much these days, obesogens?
There's quite a large number. Most of them are fungicides, in fact. And the insidious thing about that is that we're exposed to fungicides by eating fruits and vegetables. So if we eat the way we're supposed to, we will have the highest exposure to these obesogenic chemicals. So fruits and vegetables, organic is best. And if you can't afford organic, at least go to the Environmental Working Group website and don't buy the dirty dozen, the ones that have the most contamination. Buy from the clean 15, the ones that have the least level of contamination.
So that reminds me that if people really are interested in the best fruits and vegetables and how to clean them and things like that, the Environmental Working Group website has a lot of good information on that would be in addition to what Bruce has mentioned.
That's absolutely true. And I refer to their websites many times in the book. They have just a number of really good sites that provide us with the information needed to make smart choices about the products we use, the foods we eat, the water we drink. There's a lot of good information there for everyone.
Okay, there's quite a few questions, but most of them you've answered at least partially. The last one, maybe since we're over time, I'll just read the last one. It says, this person thought it was a great interview and that you need to get Oprah to read your book. And she could advertise it.
I'm
So,
sad Oprah
Maria,
doesn't still have a
maybe
show.
that's a good way to end.
That would be good. Oprah, if you're listening, I'll send you a copy autographed.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jerry. We are approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on the CHE website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the recording. CHE's next partnership webinar from the CHE Alaska Partnership will take place next Wednesday, March 28, and is titled Protecting Future Generations, the Need to Unravel Historical Intergenerational Trauma. You can RSVP through CHE's website, healthandenvironment.org. CHE's next webinar from the CHE EDC Strategies Partnership will take place Wednesday, April 18, and will feature new research on perfluoroalkyl substances and changes in body weight and resting metabolic rate in response to weight loss diets. Details will be available on our website soon. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events and more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website. Additionally, if you appreciate these CHE partnership webinars, bringing you the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank Bruce Blumberg for taking the time to talk with us today, and Jerry for serving as interviewer and moderator. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great day.